Hi, everyone. I'm Caitlin Paget, and welcome to Redefining Everything, a conversation series where absolutely everything is up for discussion. And it is my absolute pleasure today to introduce you to Sean Smith, who's become a really important man in my life. We met almost, not even, it was like just over a year and a half ago.
Right. Yeah.
Feels like a lot longer. And I'd love it if you can just let everybody know a little bit about who you are.
Yeah. It does feel like it's been so much longer. Um, Sean Smith, as you said, I've been in the coaching world. I've been coaching and speaking for 12, 13 years now. And primarily my work has been with women as you know, and it wasn't at all planned that way. It was, my divine appointment to be picked up by the Mary Kay world, um, and so I've learned a lot about the female mind, and especially as an entrepreneur, what is it that a lot of women are struggling with when they try to make phone calls, when they try to sell their services, when they try to manage their time, and just all the challenges that we have as entrepreneurs. I always knew what that was like from a man perspective, but not from a woman's perspective. So my journey, as I look back with wisdom, was, I think, twofold. Number one, well, threefold now that I think about it. Number one, to understand more of the female mind that I didn't understand. And as a result of that, number two was to get in touch with my own femininity. And that's generally not okay as men, right? But the third one, and the most meaningful one to me, was to heal my relationship with my mom. And none of that would have happened. The healing with my mom wouldn't have happened had I not done those first two pieces. And so now I look back and I realize why I was sent there, if you will, or why that, why I was divinely appointed to that crowd. So I've been focusing on human behavior for 12 years and 13 years. And it's really just an exercise in trying to understand myself, put myself under the microscope, figure some stuff out, and then teach people what I learned. And it, the depth of this work is so profound, which is why I love talking to you, because when you're willing to get into these conversations about everything, I love this title and I love the subtitle, because we do need to take a look at everything in our lives in order to really be successful at anything. We've got to look at everything, because we aren't compartmentalized in our lives. And so many of us don't realize that one little piece of a belief or a conflict or some kind of trauma that we have in the background, or some kind of shame or guilt that we're holding on to, affects everything. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, we think that if we just focus on this one area of making money or success or losing weight or becoming sober or whatever the one area is, we think that that's going to increase our happiness. And quite often it actually does the opposite, which doesn't make any logical sense, right? You lose the weight and you're more depressed, or you make more money and you feel less worthy. Like, that doesn't make any sense, but that's because we are one holistic being. So I love that in your series, we're opening up everything. And I couldn't imagine a better person than you to manage these conversations, because you really have the body for it.
Oh, thank you. That means a lot. And it's really interesting because I think now, as I look back also, on my journey, how this quest, like, I've been so curious for so much of my life, and have often found myself in situations that wasn't so, what would have been prescribed for me, or stepping away, definitely a lot of out of the box living, I would say. And yet I still carried with me so many stories about how I thought I was able to show up in the world. And so while I do believe that it's always been sort of my divine appointment or my calling to be in this place of questioning and also challenging assumptions and stereotypes just by the way I've lived my life and the kinds of relationships I've been in and all of these things. But it isn't until very recently that I think I started to really understand, and we talk about having the body for it, or sort of the embodied experience around things, really understand how many unconscious stories I still was holding on to. And this is something I was so interested in talking to you about, because I really do believe that it's been part of knowing you and some of the work that we've done together, which also led to redefining everything as a concept, as a conversation series, which is that we really do have the ability to not only understand our stories, which I think from a therapeutic perspective, I always really understood, but definitively change them or decide to assign completely different meaning to things. And that was almost one of those, it was definitely one of those like ka-ching, kind of, not ka-ching in a money way, but like kaboom maybe, but like, moments where I remember you said it at a retreat that we were at, and you said, what if there were no stories? What if everything that you thought that you knew to be true up until today didn't have to have that meaning that you think that it has? And really that for me is the sort of underpinning of so many of these conversations and the work this transformational work that we're involved in. And you and I were speaking before we started recording, that this is something that's still, for so many people, is either a very distant concept or not even part of our consciousness, that we actually can change how we think about ourselves profoundly and how we think about our place in the world and our relationship to the world and to other people. Because, I wrote this to you, we hear so often, and we say it to ourselves too, well, it's just the way I am.
Yeah.
Or, oh, this always happens, this always happens. Or, of course, even just that, of course this happened, of course there's traffic on the day, just how often we are telling ourselves that we are a certain way, or that we need to expect something, the same thing, or the same kind of treatment, or the same bad luck, or the same, a client of mine was just talking about how she's like, well, did it again, and then in a more deeper conversation saying that she already pretty much knew she was going to mess up. So it was just almost just like, well, what's the point of even trying anyways? And how many of us are like that? How many of us have those experiences? And so I'd love to hear from you. You've been doing this for 12 years, which is also longer than most coaches that I know. What are some of the most powerful examples that you've seen of people who really had such a fixed idea of who they were or what they could expect from the world, and were able to completely access a new part of themselves, or a new reality, or a new story, or a new meaning? And I think it's interesting, because I know from doing this work and being in the room with people who've also experienced really, really powerful shifts. But I think, there's some things that sometimes I think we just think are off limits even, it's like, well, that part's never going to change.
Oh boy. You know how much of a geek I am about this conversation specifically. So before I get to a few of those stories, because so many of them are like popping in my head right now. What you spoke about is, as you know, I call this neurotransformation, because we neurologically learn when we're young who we are, how the world is, how safe people are, how safe money is, success. As we're growing up, we're learning all of these things just by taking, exploring the world and taking a look around and seeing what's safe and what's not safe, and what's okay and what's not okay, and where is our place in the world. And we're making all these decisions. And I mean, I get sad hearing some of the things that you said. People are like, of course, that's always just happens to me. But if we trace that back, there was a point when nobody believed that. There was a point for all of us where we didn't have any of those disempowering stories. And in reality, all of the pain that we have and all of the sabotage and all these fears, it's just a story. It's just a story that's been told over and over and over and over again. And it's accumulated so much evidence that we then think it's real. But reality is nothing more than a story plus evidence. That's all it is. Once upon a time, we didn't have that reality because we didn't have the story. And then what happens as we tell a story over and over and over again, it literally gets into our body. It gets into our cells. And that's when it gets under our conscious radar, something that you mentioned. And when it moves from our consciousness to our unconsciousness into our neurology, then we have no reason to challenge it. And then we language this disempowering feeling like, oh, that's just always what happens. And the more that we language it, the more that we lodge it in our body. And when it's lodged deep down inside, how can you change anything? It's just what is. That's the way we hold on to so many of our stories. So neurotransformation is going from our conscious stories into what's been learned by our bodies. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of research now that is saying scientifically that our bodies are making the decisions for us. Most of our decisions are actually being made by our bodies, not by our brains. Our bodies are seeing what's around, and our body knows how to respond according to the stimuli in our environment, right? So something happens, our bodies go, oh, okay, well, this is where I retreat. This is where I start crying. This is where I start eating. This is where I get hungry. This is where I get angry, right? Our bodies are telling us this is how to respond to what's happening. And because it's our bodies making those choices, number one, we don't even realize there's a choice being made. We don't realize this is an option that we are choosing. We just think this is the way it is. And then number two, we don't have the awareness to go in and go, how can we change these stories? Because they don't feel like stories. So once we understand that these are just stories that have been told so often that they feel like reality, then we have to look at the languaging of the stories. And so if we go top down, we have to take a look at how many times we're saying, of course, how many times we're saying, I always fail, how many times we're saying, all my relationships end in disaster. And then we've got to, if we're willing to, then we've got to take a look at what's the effect that that's having, what do we really want in our lives, and then how can we change it? And this is where you and I get so excited, is that we can change it. We really, truly can change some of the stories. We can change all of the stories that have created this body of ours. And this is the embodiment piece that you mentioned, that lives a little bit below the conscious layer. But if we go below that conscious, that layer, if we go below the body that we've created, that's our truth. That's who we truly are at the core. That's where love lives. But for most of us, love is being covered up by these stories that are now in our body. And then above that is our consciousness. So we're really kind of working on three different layers here. And because who we truly are, our self-worth, our esteem, our love, our value is underneath this layer, most of us don't have access to it. And so we don't even know that it's possible. But once upon a time, that's all we were. As babies, that's all we were. So the stories of transformation that I've seen where not just the mind changes. See, we think that a breakthrough is when you have a new thought and it makes you kind of lean back in your chair and go, wow, I never looked at it that way. That's an intellectual breakthrough. But a neurological breakthrough is where your body shifts and go, wow, I've never felt this way.
Mm-hmm.
Or you re-feel something that you haven't felt in a long time. And that's when the shift happens from inside out. And then you don't even have to wrestle so much with the intellect, because you've touched something that really does the work neurologically, and it really truly changes. So there are a few stories that I can recall right now. One of them is with my wife, and so this is a very dear story to me. We were both attending an event, and she was doing an exercise. I was actually an assistant at this event. She was doing an exercise where you're supposed to go back and remember a traumatic event in your life and then change the story. Everything we're talking about, we call it reframing. Let's reframe the story. You can't change what happened, but you can change the story that you put on it. And so she went back to this time where she was 5, 6 years old, and her dad was teaching her how to ride a bike, but then he had to leave for work, and he left before she learned how to ride the bike. But she stayed out there. And after several minutes, she actually taught herself how to ride the bike. And it was this moment of this little child, like, look what I've done. I taught myself. I'm a big kid. And so she goes into the kitchen and tells her mom, I taught myself how to ride this bike. And she's expecting this celebration and all this stuff. And her mom turned around and she gave her this look. And the look wasn't of celebration, the look was more of disappointment. And that really got lodged in her body, like this was disappointment in her. And so as we were talking through that a little bit later, she was really stuck on trying to change this event. And what she said was, I don't understand how this isn't disappointment. And then I just asked her, what if it was disappointment, but what if it wasn't disappointment in you? What if it was her own disappointment that you just saw? And as soon as she considered that, her whole body just changed. It was like all the pain that she had been holding on to about how she's a disappointment, or she's trying to impress people, her mom, her dad, me, everybody, it just completely went away. And when you see a human body transform like that, it's amazing. I'm thinking of another time at an event where a woman had all this guilt and shame around not telling her 2 children that she had had before them. She had had a baby who died on Valentine's Day. And they never knew that they had an older sister that had died early. And the shame that this woman was carrying around was so intense. You could see it on her body. You could see it on her face. And so we did some processing in the room, and I don't remember the exact details now, but it was more about internal relationship, right? It wasn't about her keeping and protecting her children from this truth. And her children were like 12 and 14 now. I mean, this is a long time that she's been protecting them. And can you imagine what happens every Valentine's Day? I mean, it just gets lit up so much. And we did some kind of processing in the room, and she just kind of went inside and looked at her relationship with herself. And she put her head down. That she got to the point where this is so exhausting. I can't take this anymore. And she put her head down like this. And she was, just kind of crying and connecting with herself. I wasn't even talking to her anymore. And Caitlin, when she came back up, I my legs got weak, because she came back up and it was like a different human face. And everybody that was watching her, there were about 6 of us that were watching her. We all just went, oh, like it was shocking to see her face was different, and that kind of transformation is possible. And sometimes it can happen very fast, and sometimes it takes, some months or some years. I mean, you and I know Michelle Moore. I know you've done some interviews with her, and she might even show up in this series. And what I've seen in her over the course of 4 years in releasing so many of these layers of trauma and deep wounds, and then to see who has come out of that, it's like she's been resurrected. Her little girl has been uncovered. And now what she's doing in the world, coaching people and advocating so hard for other people to make these same shifts that she's made, are amazing. And I'll just tell one more that this will be quick. I remember a woman who had been deep trauma in her childhood. Now you've said these conversations like anything goes, right? So I imagine I can share a little bit of a detail. But she had been molested by her brother for years and years and years. And she'd been carrying around this incredible pain. And I actually invited her up to in front of the room, and I was going to do a coaching demonstration on her. And I thought I was going to, impress everybody with my abilities and so forth. And she just came up in the room and she just started crying. And after about 20 seconds, she started laughing. And after about another 30 seconds, she got up and she just walked back. And she's like, I'm good. And so in a matter of a minute, maybe 2 minutes tops, she just expressed this emotion that she hadn't expressed before. And then she didn't even really need to do anything else. And so the way that the human mind and body work together is fascinating. And for a lot of us, all we need to do is know that transformation is possible and allow our bodies to cry, or allow our bodies to be angry, allow ourselves to express some of this stuff that we've repressed for so long. And that's all that needs to happen for some people. Now, that's not all that needs to happen for everybody, but because we all have our own journeys. So I would never do anybody a disservice by saying, I know what you need. Mm-hmm. Like, you need this one exercise, or you need this one conversation. I don't know what everybody needs, but I know it's possible for everyone. And for a lot of people, that's the biggest lesson that they need to live into and to lean into, is that, number one, it's possible. But as you and I were talking before we started recording, for most people, we don't see this. We don't see these kinds of transformations. We don't hear these kinds of stories. And so how can we know it's possible when we don't think it is for ourselves and we don't see it for anybody else? So there isn't a safe space for so many people to get into these kinds of conversations. And one of my hopes for this whole series, not just this interview, is that it plants some seeds for some people to realize, what if I did start to explore my own stories? What if I did take a look at my pain or my fears or my sabotaging patterns, that I am not a perfectionist. I just have perfection stories. I am not afraid of relationships. I just have relationship stories that produce fear, right? When we start to redefine everything as a story, then it starts to lose its grip on us. And we start to lose our victim positioning in the story. And then we start to detach and realize, this is just a story that I was a part of, but this is not me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that so much. And you touched on something, well, many things, but you touched on something that I'm glad you did, because I wanted to segue into that a little bit as well, is that, so often I think we don't even go there, all the things that you just described, like we don't want to touch on the pain. We don't even want to examine that another story might be possible, sometimes because we don't feel safe in order to do that. We don't feel safe in our relationships, in our current, or even with ourselves. We're afraid of what might happen if we let down the guard, if we let down the facade, if we You were so busy always trying to keep it all together, therefore always reinforcing these things to ourselves. And something that I've seen you do masterfully in a small group and in a room of, more than 100 people is create the conditions of safety, like almost like giving permission for people to start to ask themselves these questions and to have these moments of breakthrough, sometimes, as you said, that happen really fast, sometimes over the course of an hour, sometimes over a weekend, or a couple of days. And the other thing, so I'd love to hear your thoughts just around how in our lives, maybe we don't have access to this kind of coaching or a retreat. How can we sort of look at how to create that safe space for ourselves in order to be able to explore some of these questions? And maybe this is another topic, but also the other thing, and I really didn't know this about you until we were doing this training recently in Irvine, is how like your ability also to help facilitate this kind of transformation for people who not only have experienced like their own personal traumas, but systemic oppression, groups of people who are generally, not generally, I don't want to say that, but like who have been more marginalized, who have faced, white supremacy, systemic racism, other racial injustices, queer folks, queer women, like you as a straight white man, more so like, and I'm not really in the straight white man coaching world for any of my own reasons. I just haven't, it hasn't appealed to me, but there was something about you when you and I connected, I felt drawn to you for reasons when you and I met at that event in Texas. But it just like brought it home to me in such a powerful way when we did this training in Irvine, of just your ability to, because I guess, okay, so I guess I'm thinking as I go here, but I know because of circles that I've been a part of and work that I've done and anti-oppression work that I've done, that there's also sometimes this reactionary, like, oh, but that might work for you, but it's not going to work for me, or it's not going to work for X group of people. And I used to do a lot of ally work and like advocacy work of like, yeah, but you don't understand intergenerational trauma. You don't understand, like, that's a nice example you gave about your wife, and I know for your wife, like, I know I'm not trying to minimize that in any way. Like, I know that shifted so many things for her, but somebody might be watching this and saying like, okay, but that's kind of like a cute example, what about the people who have like just had it from all sides and from multiple generations and carry this like, So two different questions, I guess, that came to me. One about safe space and like creating the conditions for safety for ourselves and each other. And the other one around how does this work, or how have you seen it work for folks? And I know you have, so it's a bit of a, I've been in the room when I've seen some of that transformation happen for folks that are have experienced, trauma that isn't just their own personal trauma, but the kind of systemic oppression that communities of color and other communities face. So I'm curious, just you have seemed to been able to bridge between your very different life experience and maybe some of who you started out working with to now really being able to help facilitate this transformation for other folks coming from some pretty different life experiences.
Oh, this is so good.
I know. I'm like, do we have 4 hours?
I know, right? So question number one, how do we find those safe spaces when they're not on every corner? Mm-hmm. And most people don't have these safe conversations in their lives. And what a lot of people will do is decide that those safe spaces are not available because they're not in their family. So I just don't have anybody to talk to. You do. You just got to go find them. I don't know how well this analogy fits, but eagles don't flock. Eagles are a certain kind of bird that don't flock together. but they do fly together at times, but you've got to go search them out. So you've got to find the places where that safety resides with other people. That's one piece. And what I can tell you is that they do exist. The bigger piece, and probably the scarier piece for most people, as you said, is the inner safety. Because in reality, the reason that we don't feel safe generally in front of other people is because we don't feel safe generally with ourselves. And that's simple and scary as hell. So the simple way to create and explore safety with yourself is to be with yourself. It's to turn inward. You know, I have this phrase that I'm just kind of developing, and it's turn into yourself, and it means two things. Number one, become who you're meant to be, but number two, which is more important, turn inward to yourself, because that's where the answers are. That's where the safety is. That's where all the stories started. That's where all the work has to be done, because that's where all the knots were tied. They were not tied by other people. Other people could have been influential, right? Other people may have abused us physically, sexually, verbally, energetically, other races. So I'm not taking other people's participation out of the equation, but at the same time, we are the ones that are perpetuating the stories ultimately. And I say this from an empowering perspective, not an insensitive perspective. The disempowering perspective is, they did this to me, therefore I have to respond the way I have responded. That sounds really good, but it's disempowering. They did this, therefore I have to, is reactionary in nature. And if they did this, then they have to undo this. And the reality is, whoever they is, whether it's a single person or a system, as you said, systemic racism, systemic oppression against homosexuals, against black people, against white people, against Jewish people, against whatever, Native Americans. If it's gigantic systemic oppression, or if it's a single event or a single person, regardless of who they are, if they are the ones that did this, then they are the ones that have to undo this, but they probably don't have the capacity to undo this, otherwise they wouldn't have done it in the first place. So what we're asking in this story of safety, and I'm going to continue to unpack this so that it doesn't land insensitively, but what we're doing is perpetuating the story that we are a victim of somebody else. And that person that at that time did the hurting, did the oppressing, did the abusing, they don't have the capacity to undo something that they did because of who they are or who they were. So hopefully this is making sense the way I'm trying to articulate it. I don't want people to just be waiting at the bus stop for a bus that's not coming. And so when we're waiting for other people to change us or to change the system, then we're actually moving away from the source, which is us, that can do the work. And so the reality is, nobody has to change externally for us to change our experience of the world. And I say that with love and compassion and advocacy for empowerment. That's where I'm coming from, not a place of insensitive and, let's pretend that you weren't a victim of racism, or let's pretend that you weren't abused. Let's pretend that you weren't molested. Let's pretend that you didn't grow up in these horrific circumstances. We're not playing the pretend game. We're playing the empowered game. And in order to be empowered, we have to take responsibility back from the people that we've given the responsibility to. And that's not easy, but it is the answer. And more importantly than that, it is possible. So you asked earlier, what are some of the other transformations? And I just want to add another thing because I think it's relevant to what we're talking about here. At my live events, I do a process where people have to write down just a few bullet points of some of the most significant things that have happened to them in their lives. And most of my work is with women. And a lot of women have been abused in some way, shape, or form, or they've been disempowered, whether it's systemic or individual in nature. And so you've got a lot of women that write down, like, I was raped, or I had an abortion, or I was abused over and over again in my relationships. And they don't know that I'm going to ask them to tell this story. They're just writing down these most significant events, and most of them or a lot of them are painful. And then I have them tell the story. But the first story that they have to tell is the story as a victim. So they tell their story of all these things that happened to them, and they victimize everything, like, oh, poor me. I was, I got a C in my math class. And part of it is fun. Like, we take things that aren't that big of a deal and we turn them into a big deal. But part of it for a lot of women, specifically women, is very tough because these are traumatic experiences. But then I have them tell the story as a hero. And they say these experiences that have happened to them, but they have to make it positive. So I was abused, and because of that, I have a stronger relationship with my kids. And when they say that, they shift. And that's the kind of neurological transformation that can happen just by telling a story. And when I ask the audience that does this, I usually ask, how many of you just told a story for the very first time? You've never told the positive part, the positive perspective of that story, and almost every hand goes up. And the transformation that happens, and sometimes they cry, and sometimes they get excited, and sometimes they shout, but the transformation that can happen just by telling a different story for the first time is insane. And what it does is it causes us to look at the things that have happened to our lives, in our lives, and shift the story. So that safe space is about us going inside and us taking a look at who we are without judgment and without trying to defend. And it's going to be, for everybody that I've talked to, it's going to be a deeply emotional experience, because most of us haven't turned around and looked into our souls. We're so consumed with protecting ourselves from the pain that lives down in there that we've never actually taken a look and explored who we truly are. What are the dreams that we still have? What are the pains that we are hiding? What are the tears that are uncried? What are the hopes that we have deep down inside? There's such a tenderness that happens when we go inside and we play with our most human parts. When we explore every corner of our soul, it's scary for most people because it's uncomfortable. But I think it's the greatest gift we can give ourselves, to know ourselves. And when we're willing to do that work at some level, that's where safety really, truly happens. But I'll say that that's the answer, but I'll also say that for most people, because of what we've already talked about, they can't just go inside and go, okay, well, let me just explore everything, and now I'm good, and now I'll be able to drop all of these stories. So as simple as I'm making it sound, it's not easy. And that's why we do need support. We need coaches. We need mentors. We need people that we can trust, people that we can share our dialogue with, people that we can read our journal entries to. So that's the ultimate solution, but that's not the easiest thing. Like, that's not step one necessarily. but it is the ultimate solution, that we have to create safety with ourselves so that we stop abusing ourselves. The reality is, the thing that most of us are most afraid of is the self-abuse that we do to ourselves. It's self-inflicted pain. It may have been inflicted by somebody else first in our past, and maybe even repeated, but the real trauma that we keep perpetuating, even in stories that might sound innocent, like what you were saying early in the call. Oh, here it is again. Here it goes. This is who I am. Of course, this happens to me. That's abuse. Mm-hmm. That's an abuse pattern, continually and perpetuating this story saying, I'm not good enough, I can't win. And those stories are painful to us. So reality is, we've got to start to take over our own responsibility for creating this safe space, and getting into environments where other people are safe is part of the journey. Ultimately, it's really, do we have the capacity to love ourselves and be compassionate with ourselves, even when we mess up, even though we were abused, even though we were, we experienced this pain in our past. Even in that state, can we still love ourselves? And what's so interesting, Caitlin, is that for those of us that have kids, or those of us that have nieces and nephews, we would never, ever be insensitive to those kids who mess up. We would love them and encourage them and be their cheerleader and say, it's okay, you just get back up and keep trying, it's okay. But very, very rarely are we like that with ourselves. And we have an inner child just like these external children that we're looking at. And our inner child needs us to be compassionate, just like we are naturally compassionate with these kids. And if we did just a little bit more of that with ourselves, if we were just 5% more gentle and compassionate with ourselves and more understanding with ourselves, some of these layers of pain and some of these layers of protection would start to melt away. The second question you asked is related to that. It's, how do we create this space, and how do we do some of the healing that's much bigger than the individual bodies that we have? And so if you don't mind, I just want to add a few details onto the story that you gave, just so everybody understands a little bit of the context of what I'm about to say. So at this event that you're referencing, there was a lot of healing that happened for this particular man, which is a whole nother conversation. And you know how much I want to talk about masculinity, but he was a black man. And I say but, not to invalidate everything, but to add to the story that a lot of his pain was because of the oppression that you alluded to. Being a black man in white America is a story that nobody really truly understands other than the people who are in those shoes. And you and I can think that we get it. I've thought that I've had compassion for the journey of the black man as much as I can, but I really still can't know. And I've gotten into so many conversations with black men and women that have expanded my capacity to understand and realize that I can sympathize as much as I think I'm able to, but I can't really know what it's like to be growing up and be at the Thanksgiving table and hearing stories about my great uncle who was literally lynched from a tree. You know, I don't have those stories. To me, as the white man, like you're talking about, those are stories that I've read about in a textbook. Those are stories that I've seen on TV. And I've cried tears about the awfulness of that, but I've not heard about it at the Thanksgiving table. Those are not the stories that are told at family reunions. So they're not in my neurology. They are in my intellect, but not my neurology. And that understanding is a completely different awareness. Now, I'm only using this as an example because you and I have this shared experience of just a few weeks ago, but this is in all of us. This is just one example of a Black man. And when he started to tap into those stories of oppression, he triggered a lot of the Black women in the room who, for the first time, saw their Black husbands or their Black children or their Black fathers or their Black friends in the pain of this Black man. And what happened with that kind of connection was so profound, and it deeply touched a lot of us that don't have that story. And it was so incredible to see the connection that could only come through this neurological expression of trauma and of pain. And he wasn't even really truly talking about being a Black man in America, but that's where his pain was coming from. So without the words even being spoken, the pain that came out of this very masculine man touched these women, and everybody was touched, but specifically touched these Black women, and they recognized that pain in a way that they've never been able to articulate before. And so the interactions that happened during that event and after that event and in the stories since then was so profound. And to take that scenario and then answer your specific question, how have I specifically, who doesn't have those stories in my neurology, how can I have the capacity for that? It's simply because I've learned over these 12 years that it's okay for me to touch my own human roots. And you and I even were talking a little bit about this before we started recording. We all, as humans, we all have a connection at a very deep level. And I call that our roots, our human roots. Each and every one of us has a human story that is at the core. It's so innocent. It's so raw. It's about love. That's really all it is. It's about love and wanting to be loved and wanting to be loved. And then we experience all these things that we experience in life according to our own details, our own upbringing, the cards that we were dealt, and the things that happen to us uniquely. And then our own gardens, our own flowers and our own weeds all grow from those roots. And that's where, if we take a look at the Black man and the white woman, or the Native American man and the Jewish man, or the who cares what the difference is, the Asian, the American, we take a look at gay, straight, man, woman, all these seemingly dichotomous differences are at the surface. If we're looking above the surface, we see the differences. We see the skin color. We see the difference in lifestyle. It's easy to see all the differences, and we're so afraid of the differences because we don't think that we can control the differences. We don't understand the differences. So that's when white men hate Black men, or straight people hate gay people, or Christians hate Hindus, and whatever form of hatred it is, it could just be a non-acceptance. That's a form of hatred. We're hating the differences. And when we see and judge and then respond to the differences above the surface, we're forgetting in that moment that if we go deep enough, we are the same human. We are the same human story. And that's where the connection really happens. So what happened in that room, and what can happen between men, women, gay, straight, Christian, Muslim, what can happen when we drop down to our roots and then we play at that level, there's such a familiarity there. There's such a connection there. And all of our detachments and all of our judgments and all of our prejudices and all of those differences and the need to protect, all of those are so far up above us that they don't live here. It's like watching a little black baby and a white baby before they're taught to not like each other. Watch them play in the sandbox together. They don't know that there's any difference. They just know that there's love inside of this other human body, so they play together. That's kind of what we're doing. We're going back so deep into our humanity that all there is connection. And so what I've learned to do, even though none of this was conscious at any point, what I've learned to do is be okay with my own humanity and being willing enough to play at that deeper level that it makes it safe for other people to do it as well. And when we can play at this deeper level, it doesn't matter how different we are above the surface. You and I are the same human entity. We are the same heart, craving love and fearing pain. And when we can connect at that level, then the details don't matter, because that's only where the differences are. The differences are only in the details, but the connection is in the roots. And so that's what happened in that room. That's what I've seen happen in so many other rooms. And that's what I've experienced in my journey over these 12 years. You know, when I got into the Mary Kay world, I became a coach in Mary Kay. So I want to be very clear. I started to coach women in Mary Kay who were selling lipstick and skincare. And that's not what I thought I was going to be doing in life. But I connected with something that, even though at the time I wasn't conscious of, I needed to connect to. And because I was willing to do a lot of this work on myself, I started to become a very safe man for women who've been abused on some level, whether it's sexual abuse or verbal abuse or just abused by society, women who've had trauma in their past by men or by the masculine energy. I became a very safe space. And I remember telling people, like, I'm attracting all these abused women. I don't know why. I don't understand any of it, but I like it. And without my conscious strategy behind it or any kind of attention, the healing that started to happen in these rooms and in these conversations was beyond my capacity to understand intellectually. So it's like my humanity was doing some of the work before I even understood what was happening. And then I did a lot of the healing around my mom, my own self-forgiveness, and, you know, my femininity, and so much of this has made its way into my consciousness. But that's the journey that we as a species need to go through if we want to really truly reclaim the connection. And I say reclaim because this is something that already lives. We are already connected to everybody we feel disconnected from. We are already in love with everybody we hate, and they're in love with us, just not above the surface, they're not. But if we had the guts to go down underneath the covers, and then underneath that layer, and then underneath the piece that we didn't even, the ground that we didn't even know existed, and then if we realized there's something underneath that, and if we had the guts to go deep down below, all we would see is love. And then it doesn't take any effort. We don't have to effort at loving people. And with that kind of pure, raw, real, innocent love, what lives there that doesn't live up here for most of us is compassion. And you cannot hate somebody you have compassion for. It's just impossible. You don't have to deal with your anger management because anger doesn't live in compassion. So this work, what's so beautiful about this work is it's really about surrendering into what already lives. It's not about creating something that we don't possess. It's surrendering into something that already lives. It's just been covered up by our differences, by our protection mechanisms, by our our pain, by our traumas. So if we're willing to be real and be ourselves, and then take a look at who shows up, who's drawn to that beacon of authenticity, it's incredible what kind of experiences we can then create without any effort whatsoever. So this is not a skill set thing. This is a willingness thing. Do we give ourselves permission to drop into who we are, explore, play here, and then connect at the human level? We don't have to deal with all this stuff that we're wrestling with in society.
I feel like there is just so much, like, even though you and I have had these conversations before, and I've been involved in trainings with you and retreats, and I know there was a lot more that we wanted to talk about. And my intuition right now is telling me that this conversation there's a lot of gold in here and a lot to digest. And so I don't want it to feel overwhelming, if that makes sense. And so I'm hoping, I'm going to propose this to you right now as we're recording, so you better say yes.
Well, you know it's a yes. I don't care what you say. You're Caitlin Paget. I don't care what you say. You know it's a yes. So go ahead.
Well, yes, because we were going to talk about, it's so fascinating because you've been working with women for 12 years, but I know that you've been shifting. You continue to work with women, but you just use this example of what can happen when a man drops into his own pain, which is something that, even though many women, I think we feel a lot of resistance to that for many reasons, it's still more acceptable for us to do that and to seek out spaces where we can. And I know we've talked before in the past about how women do go inward, like we turn inward with our pain, with our judgments. We inflict harm on ourselves often, whereas men externalize. And there's a whole other conversation to be had that I know you really want to have around redefining masculinity. And so I'm hoping that we can table that conversation as another redefining everything conversation, specifically around masculinity and what you've come to call the masculine wound, and what you've been learning about that, both through your own journey, through your work with women, which is so fascinating, what we learn about each other when, you've been working with women, you've described connecting with your own femininity, but also what you've learned about the impact of what we might know of more commonly referred to as like toxic masculinity on women, but what you've been speaking about in terms of the masculine wound. So I'd love to continue that conversation another time, because I feel like there's no diminishing this, the amount of conversation that we've just had around really knowing how, having the willingness, being able to show up, being able to create that safety within ourselves and within others, being able to drop into our own humanity, to access our roots. And, what you did say before the call was like, when my roots meet your roots, it's like we've known each other for a lifetime. And I just thought that was so beautiful. And so I think that there's a lot. I know if I were to rewatch this, which I probably will, I'll be digesting a lot of this conversation. So if we can wrap up now and let all of the gold that we've unearthed in this conversation be what it is, and then know that we'll continue another conversation. I also wanted to give you the opportunity to share a little bit about you have a YouTube channel, and you've inspired me to start my YouTube channel, which is part of this whole Redefining Everything conversation series. And you provide a ton of value. And so if anybody's watching this and wants to know more about Sean and where to find him and where to keep learning from him, can you just let us know a little bit about your channel and what we can expect from it and why we should subscribe? I am subscribed, but why anybody else should subscribe.
Well, thank you for that. And I just want to highlight what you said. I do feel like it's a wise decision to not try to throw the masculinity conversation just on top of this and everything we've gotten into without any pre-strategy on yours and my part was the foundation of all of that, because manhood is one of the ways that we've grown from those roots, and it has its own separate journey, just like the Black journey, just like the homosexual journey, just like the addicted journey, just like all of these journeys have their own separate stem. And if we don't understand the roots, then we can't really understand the stem that comes from the roots. So I think it would be brilliant to have a conversation just on that. And thank you for mentioning the YouTube channel. My handle everywhere is Coach Sean Smith. So my channel is youtube.com/Coach Sean Smith. And I've been putting up videos here and there for a long time now, but I've never really been intentional. And so what this channel is going to be is an intentional, consistent conversation around everything. Similar to this series, everything is in bounds, because what I am committed to is coaching human behavior. And human behavior involves every single thing out there. It involves the pain. It involves the limiting beliefs. It involves skill set. It involves goal setting. It involves relationships. It involves parenting. And so what I'm committed to, and what I have the body for now, is this understanding of humanity and understanding of neurotransformation, and then how it relates to coaching and how it relates to all these different applications of life. So the channel is really dedicated primarily right now toward the coaching conversation for people who want to be coaches, but also for people who want to understand human behavior through the coaching lens. And, you know, we started talking about what are some of the places that people can get those safe spaces. One of the places is videos that are talking about this. It kind of gives a way to be in the conversation without the fear of other people around you, because you've got this intimate space of just the video. So that's one of the things that I want to provide for people, are these safe conversations and introductions to pain and trauma and limiting beliefs and fears and sabotage and all these things. So, I mean, you know me, Caitlin, there's no end to the topics that are going to come out on these channels. And I'm a teacher at heart, so I really want to give people an understanding at a deeper level of what is possible, as well as application of how to actually do it. Because if all we do is go down and play around at that deep root level, but we don't know how to apply it to parenting, or we don't know how to apply it to goal setting, then that's, I would say, a different kind of useless than understanding what to do, but not realizing the roots and the stems that are keeping us from doing all those things, right? So we need to play in both of those arenas, the consciousness and the intellect, plus the subconscious and the humanity. We need to play in those places together. There's got to be a connection rather than just an either or. And that's what I really hope to provide for as many people as possible in this channel, and resources. You know, I'm a life coach, so we've got life coaches on the team, and I want to provide people with free life coaching opportunities for people that have never experienced that, and just open up this whole conversation around humanity, you know, and healing our wounds, whether it's men or women or Black or white or gay or straight or Muslim or Christian or atheist, whatever it is. We're all humans. And contrary to what it looks like above the surface, we are way more similar than different. And if we can drop down to that level, we can create a neurotransformation for ourselves, and we can create a neurotransformation in our communities, and ultimately, hopefully, on our planet.
Yay. I love it.
I'm honored to be walking that journey with you arm in arm, because you are one of those neurotransformational forces that I honor and admire so much. And I'm grateful to be side by side with you in this mission.
Thank you so much, Sean. And, you know, I feel so much the same way. And it was a no-brainer for me to have you as our first official conversation that we're launching for the Redefining Everything series. And I'm so grateful to know you. I'm so grateful from day one, as I said, when I first met you, my first hug, our first hug that we had.
I remember our first little talk before we got onto the bus. I don't remember where we went, but I remember in the lobby, I just remember the first talk after you had spoken. and I had spoken,
Yeah.
and there was a little bit of a shared experience. I can so clearly remember that communication with you, and maybe we talked a little bit in the room, but for me, that was the first real connection, and I don't think I'll ever forget that.
Aw. Yeah, it was, I mean, I felt it right from the beginning too. And as I said, I had no idea at the time just how much we would connect around, because we were at an event with a specific focus. And so it's just been so amazing to continue the relationship and to continue learning from you and sharing space with you and peeling back all of these layers
Right, we
and
got
digging
plenty
in.
of them.
Yeah, so many. And so I
I'm
really
only 12 years into this journey. I'm just getting
I
started.
I know, exactly. So I look forward to continuing the conversation, and I'm super excited for all of the amazing content that you share and how you show up in the world. So thank you, and to be continued.
Thank you for that. I'm honored. Can't wait for part 2.
Fantastic.